Somewhere in Japan, a household earning a modest, unremarkable income is quietly building real financial security. Not through a high-paying job, not through aggressive investing, not through any secret most people would recognize as a money hack. They're doing something far less exciting and far more effective. They're following a set of financial habits so old, so unglamorous, that most modern personal finance advice has completely forgotten they exist. Meanwhile, in much of the rest of the world, people earning significantly more money report feeling constantly behind financially. Anxious about spending, uncertain about saving, caught in a cycle where more income never quite seems to translate into more security. This isn't really about income at all. It's about a fundamentally different relationship with money. One where restraint isn't a punishment, where spending isn't a reward, and where financial peace comes not from earning more, but from needing less. And understanding precisely why that distinction matters. By the end of this video, you may understand why so many financial habits considered normal in much of the world are quietly working against you, and what a genuinely different approach looks like in practice. Let's start with something that might sound surprising. Japan, as a nation, has one of the highest household savings rates among developed economies, alongside a culture that, on average, spends noticeably less on discretionary consumption than many comparably wealthy countries. This isn't simply a matter of national policy or economic circumstance. It reflects a set of deeply embedded cultural values around money. Values that operate quietly in ordinary households, largely without any formal financial education at all. To understand where these values come from, it helps to look at a concept we've touched on in a different context before. Motenai. Roughly translated, it means, "what a waste," but that translation undersells its emotional weight. Motenai isn't a passive observation. It's closer to a genuine, felt regret at the thought of something valuable being wasted. Whether that's food, materials, time, or money. It's an emotional response, not just a rational calculation, and this distinction matters enormously, because emotional responses shape behavior far more reliably than rational arguments do. In many Japanese households, motenai shapes financial behavior in ways so ordinary they're barely noticed. Leftover food isn't simply thrown away, it's repurposed into another meal. Clothing is repaired rather than replaced at the first sign of wear. Objects are used until they're genuinely no longer functional, not merely until they're no longer new or exciting. None of this is treated as deprivation. It's treated as basic competence. The same way most people consider it basic competence to lock their front door at night. Here's where this connects directly to psychology, and specifically to a concept called hedonic adaptation, that we touched on briefly in an earlier discussion. Human beings adapt remarkably quickly to new possessions, new levels of spending, and new lifestyle upgrades. An expensive purchase that felt thrilling on the day it arrived typically fades into ordinary background reality within weeks, sometimes days. This is why chasing satisfaction through spending is, from a psychological standpoint, an inherently losing game. The goalposts move as quickly as you reach them. Motenai, practiced consistently, works directly against this pattern. When you resist unnecessary spending, not through white-knuckled restraint, but through a genuine emotional aversion to waste, you're not constantly recalibrating your baseline expectations upward. Your sense of enough stays relatively stable, rather than perpetually chasing whatever the next upgrade happens to be. This is a profoundly different psychological experience from the more common Western pattern of continuously expanding consumption, followed by continuously expanding expectation. Let's bring in a second concept now, one that shapes how many Japanese households actually structure their spending: Kakeibo. This is a household budgeting method with roots dating back over a century, and it remains widely practiced today, particularly among Japanese women managing household finances, though its principles apply universally. Unlike most modern budgeting apps, which focus heavily on automation, categorization, and passive tracking, Kakeibo is deliberately manual, deliberately slow, and built around a specific psychological insight that most contemporary personal finance tools completely overlook. The core practice of Kakeibo involves physically writing down income and expenses by hand. Then asking 4 specific reflective questions at the start of each month. How much money is available? How much would you like to save? How much are you actually spending? And how can you improve? What makes this method distinctive isn't the tracking itself. Plenty of apps track spending automatically. It's the deliberate friction built into the process. Writing expenses by hand, rather than having them logged automatically, forces a moment of conscious attention to each transaction that automated tracking, by design, eliminates entirely. This connects to a well-documented phenomenon in behavioral economics called decision fatigue, combined with something researchers call the pain of paying. Studies on payment methods have consistently found that the psychological discomfort associated with spending money, what researchers literally term payment pain, decreases significantly as the payment method becomes more abstracted from physical cash. Paying with cash produces measurably more spending awareness and discomfort than paying with a card, which in turn produces more awareness than a stored digital payment method, which in turn produces more than an automatic subscription charge you barely notice each month. Kakeibo's manual, handwritten structure deliberately reintroduces a version of this payment pain into the tracking process itself, even when the actual purchases were made electronically. The physical act of writing down what you spent creates a small but real moment of psychological friction, a brief pause for reflection that purely automated tracking systems are specifically designed to remove in the name of convenience. And it turns out that this removed friction wasn't simply an inconvenience being eliminated. It was a moment of awareness being eliminated along with it. Now, let's connect this to something even deeper in Japanese financial culture: the relationship between money and social display, which differs meaningfully from patterns common in many other wealthy nations. There's a concept worth introducing here, one that doesn't have a single clean English translation, but is sometimes rendered as shibui, a specific aesthetic and cultural value describing understated, unobtrusive elegance, the deliberate avoidance of anything flashy or ostentatious. Shibui shows up in traditional Japanese aesthetics broadly, but it has a specific and important application to money and consumption. Historically, and to a significant degree still today, overt displays of wealth have been culturally discouraged in Japan, particularly in comparison to consumption patterns common in many Western contexts, where visible markers of financial success, luxury vehicles, designer labels, conspicuously expensive homes, often carry significant social status value. This cultural difference has genuine psychological consequences worth examining. Researchers studying what's sometimes called status consumption or conspicuous consumption, building on foundational work by economist Thorstein Veblen over a century ago, have consistently found that spending motivated primarily by social display, rather than genuine personal enjoyment or utility, tends to produce weaker and less durable satisfaction than spending on experiences or items genuinely valued for their own sake. In cultures where status consumption is less socially rewarded, this specific, less satisfying motivation for spending has less cultural fuel behind it in the first place. This doesn't mean Japanese consumer culture lacks luxury spending entirely. It clearly doesn't. But the cultural framework around it tends to emphasize quality, craftsmanship, and personal appreciation over visible social signaling. A well-made, expensive item purchased because of genuine appreciation for its craftsmanship operates on a very different psychological register than the same item purchased primarily to be seen with it. The first tends to produce lasting satisfaction precisely because the enjoyment doesn't depend on an audience. The second tends to fade quickly because the satisfaction was borrowed from other people's perceived approval in the first place, and that approval, even when received, rarely feels like enough for long. There's a related concept worth bringing in here: shokunin, roughly translating to artisan or craftsperson, but carrying cultural weight well beyond its literal translation. The shokunin ethic emphasizes complete dedication to mastering a craft, producing work of genuine quality, regardless of whether that quality is immediately visible or widely recognized. This ethic extends into how many Japanese consumers relate to the things they purchase. An appreciation for objects made with genuine care and durability, rather than objects designed primarily for rapid replacement and visible novelty. This connects directly to a financial principle increasingly discussed in Western sustainability and minimalism circles, but practiced quietly in Japan for generations. The economics of buying fewer, better things. An inexpensive item that needs replacing every year costs more, cumulatively, than a well-made item that lasts a decade, even though the second option requires a larger single payment upfront. This is sometimes called, somewhat informally, the cost-per-use principle. And it directly contradicts the psychological pull many people feel toward the cheaper immediate option, driven by what behavioral economists call present bias. Our tendency to weigh immediate costs more heavily than larger costs, distributed further into the future, even when the future cost is objectively lower over time. A culture that values shokunin quality goods, purchased less frequently, and maintained with care rather than replaced casually, is essentially structurally protected against a significant category of the kind of wasteful spending that erodes savings gradually, invisibly, purchase by seemingly reasonable purchase, over the course of years. Let's talk about one more piece of this puzzle, because it connects everything we've discussed to a broader philosophical foundation: the relationship between ikigai, the concept we've explored before as a reason for being, and financial behavior specifically. When purpose and satisfaction are rooted primarily in daily practice, relationships, craft, and presence, rather than in acquisition and consumption, spending naturally becomes less central to identity and self-worth. This isn't a moral judgment against people who do find genuine meaning in certain purchases. It's simply an observation about where the emotional weight tends to sit. In cultures or individual lives where ikigai is found largely outside of consumption, financial restraint requires far less willpower, because there's less emotional pull towards spending as compensation in the first place. Much of the spending that erodes savings in many modern lives isn't driven by genuine need or even genuine enjoyment. It's driven by emotional compensation. A difficult day answered with an online purchase, a feeling of stagnation answered with a new acquisition, a sense of emptiness temporarily filled with something that arrives in a box. When daily life already contains genuine sources of meaning and satisfaction, this specific compensatory spending pattern has considerably less pull. Now, let's bring all of this together into something practical, because understanding these cultural principles is only useful if it changes how you actually manage your own finances. The first practical application involves reintroducing mottainai into your own relationship with possessions and spending, not as guilt, but as genuine appreciation for what you already have. Before replacing something, ask honestly whether it's actually no longer functional or simply no longer novel. Before a purchase, ask whether it addresses a genuine need or desire, or whether it's compensating for something else entirely. Stress, boredom, a difficult emotion you haven't fully acknowledged. The second application involves borrowing the core insight of Kakeibo, even if you don't adopt its exact method. Reintroduce some form of friction into your spending awareness. This might mean manually reviewing your spending weekly rather than relying entirely on automated summaries, or physically writing down larger purchases before making them, creating a brief pause between impulse and action. The goal isn't complexity for its own sake. It's deliberately reversing the modern trend toward frictionless, unconscious spending, because that frictionlessness, however convenient, was never actually working in your favor. The third application involves examining your own relationship with shibui versus status consumption. This requires genuine honesty, because the distinction between spending for authentic enjoyment and spending for social signaling isn't always obvious, even to the person doing the spending. A useful, if uncomfortable, question: would you still want this purchase if no one else would ever see it, know about it, or hear about it? The answer often reveals more about the true motivation behind a purchase than the purchase itself ever could. The fourth and final application involves cultivating sources of ikigai outside of consumption specifically, because this may be the most structurally important shift of all. Financial discipline sustained purely through willpower tends to erode over time. Willpower is a genuinely limited resource, as we've discussed in a previous exploration of Kizukare. But financial discipline that emerges naturally from a life already rich in meaning, purpose, and daily satisfaction requires far less ongoing effort to maintain. Because the underlying emotional pull toward compensatory spending is simply weaker to begin with. There's a final, honest point worth making before we close, because it would be easy to romanticize all of this into something simpler than it actually is. Japan is not a financial utopia. It faces its own genuine, well-documented economic challenges. Wage stagnation, an aging population placing pressure on social systems, significant regional and generational financial anxiety among younger workers facing a very different economic landscape than their parents did. This video isn't suggesting otherwise, and it would be inaccurate and unfair to imply that these cultural principles solve every financial challenge a society or an individual might face. But the specific psychological and behavioral principles we've discussed today, the emotional weight of mottainai, the deliberate friction of Kakeibo, the quiet restraint of shibui, the durable value system of shokunin, and the anchoring effect of ikigai, found outside of consumption, remain genuinely well supported by both cultural practice and psychological research, regardless of the broader economic context surrounding them. These are principles that operate at the level of individual daily behavior, and that level remains meaningfully within your own control, whatever the larger economic landscape happens to look like. Financial security, it turns out, often has less to do with how much you earn, and considerably more to do with the quiet, largely invisible relationship you've built with the money that passes through your hands every single day. Maybe the path to financial peace was never about earning enough to finally feel secure. Maybe it's about building a relationship with money so grounded in genuine appreciation and quiet restraint that enough simply arrives sooner than expected. Of these 5 principles, mottainai, Kakeibo, shibui, shokunin, and ikigai, which one do you think would shift your own relationship with money the most if you actually practiced it? If this gave you a genuinely different way to think about money, A-Like helps this reach more people looking for that same shift. And if you'd enjoy more grounded explorations of Japanese wisdom like this one, subscribing means the next video finds you when you need it. Feel free to share this with someone who might appreciate a calmer, more intentional relationship with their own finances.